Welcome to today's lecture. Our topic is government policy, culture, religion, and international business. Today, we'll look at real tools that governments use in trade. We'll talk about anti-dumping actions. We'll talk about farm subsidies. We'll talk about patents and copyrights. We'll also talk about big political events. And these events include a lot of trade fights. By the end of this lecture, you'll understand why trade policy is never simple. You'll also understand why business managers must pay close attention to it. Trade policy sits at the meeting point of economics and politics. Governments say they support free trade, but they also protect specific industry at the same time. This tension appears again and again in the topics we cover today. Think of this lecture as a tour of many tools a government can use and the reasons why those tools are so hard to remove once they exist. Let's begin. So this is the roadmap for today. We have 8 main topics. First, we look at anti-dumping actions. These are actions that punish unfair pricing. Second, we'll look at protectionism in agriculture. Farmers are protected in almost every country. Third, we'll look at intellectual property. This means patents, trademarks, and copyrights. Fourth, we'll look at market access for goods and services that are not farm products. Fifth, we'll look at the Doha Round. This is long, unfinished trade negotiation. Sixth, we'll look at multilateral and bilateral trade agreements. Seventh, we'll look at recent threats to the trading system, including the Donald Trump tariff. Finally, we'll connect everything to real decisions that business managers must make. Keep this roadmap in mind as we move forward. I'd like to start with the opening case of Temu to explain how one government decision shakes global business. A tariff is a tax on goods from another country. A government can raise this tax or lower this tax very fast. This can shake companies all over the world. Let's look at the real story. First, let's understand one word, a tariff. That's a tax on goods coming from another country. A company pays this tax when it brings goods into the country. Often, the company adds this cost to the price. So the tax can reach to you, the consumer. And one government order can change this tax overnight. In 2025, the US tariff on China moved like a roller coaster. It started at 10% in February. It jumped all the way to 145% in April. Then it dropped to 30% after new trade deal in May. Companies could not predict the next turn. This is why we call it a roller coaster. It's totally depending on the president's decision making. And the relationship between like two nations' presidents, that impacts tariff immediately. Let's look at our first real example, Temu. Temu is a shopping app. It sells very cheap products from China. If you look at this statistics, Temu's like number one like customer is United States. More than 32% of the sales are occurred in the United States. And then you can take a look at all other rests. Tamiya used a special rule called de minimis. This rule lets small packages enter the United States with no tax. Any package under $800 was tax-free. Tamiya shipped millions of small boxes this way. It's a whole business that depended on this one rule. In May 2025, the government closed this loophole. Prices on Temu jumped right away. Users left very fast because most of the users in the United States, they used the Temu because they were like nearly half price cheaper than Amazon or eBay or any other like US-based online shopping malls. But since the tariff goes up, it's included in the consumer price and the price goes up, then there's no like a charming point for Temu products. So daily users dropped 52% in 1 month. Temu cut its advertising spending by 95%. Its app ranking fell from the top 3 to number 132. Tariffs do not stop with companies. Prices rise for normal people too. Studies from Yale University found something important. The average American family paid about $2,000 to $4,000 extra dollars every year. Money that used to buy other things went to tariffs instead. Look at this chart. Clothing prices rose about 18%. And leather goods rose about 17%. Even cars became more expensive. This shows one government rule can touch almost every product we buy. So those burdens goes to the consumers. Now let's look at our second story. This time, it's not one big company, it's many small importers. They made a big bet on tariffs. Many importers believed the tariffs would only go higher. So they took out loans. They borrowed money from banks because they were expecting the tariffs would go higher and higher. So they ordered much more inventory than usual. They borrowed the money and then they ordered the inventory for next 1 year. So they can keep the inventory at this price with a lower tax, lower tariff. And then even though the tariff goes up in the future, they can hedge that. That was their most of the small business plan. They wanted to bring goods in before the new tax starts. This felt like a smart plan at the time, and many US importers did this. But then tariffs suddenly went down again after the New Deal between the presidents. New importers had way too much stock, too much inventory. Their warehouse is filled with stocks. Some had 18 to 24 months of extra inventory sitting in warehouses. They still had to pay back their loans. Some of these companies could not survive the shock. Let's connect all the pieces. A new government comes in. It changed trade policy fast. Businesses must react right away, and this creates shocks in the market. Then the cycle can start again. So why does that matter to us? First, government decisions can move very fast. Second, businesses that adapt quickly can survive better, but they never can um, expect what is the right answer. Third, ordinary people like us, consumers, feel the impact in daily prices. Trade policy is not just the news, it's part of our daily life. First, anti-dumping actions. This module is about dumping happens when a company sells a product in another country for less than it costs at home. Some countries see this as unfair competition. Governments then create rules called anti-dumping duties. These duties raise the price of the imported good. They will see that this process is not only about economics, it's also about politics. Keep in mind that anti-dumping cases are usually filed by one industry against a specific foreign competitor. This makes the process feel very targeted, and it also makes it easy for politics to enter the picture. Let's begin with a simple question. Why do anti-dumping actions happen at all? Domestic manufacturers often feel pressure from foreign competitors. They go to their own government and ask for protection. Their claim is usually the same. They say that foreign companies are competing unfairly. This unfair competition is called dumping. Dumping means a firm sells a product abroad for less than it sells at home, or even below its own cost. Now, some of these claims do have real merit. Foreign firms sometimes do dump products to push out local competitors, but this process can become political very quickly. Business owners and their employees lobby government officials. They ask officials to protect domestic jobs. Government officials think about future elections. They know that protecting local jobs can win votes. So officials often support anti-dumping duties, even when the economic case is weak. This mix in the economics and politics is very important to remember. Notice the pattern here. If domestic industry files a complaint, the government investigates the complaint. If the dumping is found, a duty is added to the price of the imported good. On paper, this sounds like a fair, technical process. But in practice, the decision often depends on how loudly industry can lobby and how many jobs and votes are at stake in an election year. This is why the steel and chemical industries appear so often in anti-dumping case history around the world. These are large, visible, well-organized industries with strong political connections. And that combination makes them very effective at winning protection through this legal channel. The World Trade Organization, or WTO, keeps a close eye on anti-dumping actions. The WTO is worried about how often countries use this tool. This heavy use suggests that old protectionist habits have not disappeared. Instead, they may simply be hiding behind the legal process. Because of this concern, the WTO keeps pushing its member countries. It wants members to strengthen the rules that govern anti-dumping duties. Why does this matter for business? If anti-dumping rules are too easy to use, they can become a quiet form of protectionism. A country can claim it supports free trade while still blocking imports through anti-dumping cases. This is one reason international managers must watch trade policy carefully, not just tariff rates on paper. A, manage, a manager exporting steel, chemicals, or electronics into a new market should always check whether the market has an active history of anti-dumping complaints in the same industry. A sudden anti-dumping investigation can raise costs overnight, even when official tariffs schedules look completely open and friendly to trade. Protectionism in agriculture. Now let's move to our second module. This module is about protectionism in agriculture. Farming is one of the most protected industry anywhere in the world. Governments use both tariffs and subsidies to help their farmers. We'll look at real numbers from Canada, the European Union, Japan, and the United States. Then we'll discuss what this protection costs the rest of us. As we go through this module, think about why farming receives so much more protection than most manufactured products. Part of this answer is economic, but a large part of the answer is political and cultural as well. Let's look at real numbers now. This chart shows average tariff rates on agricultural products in 4 economics. Canada charges an average tariff of 15%. European Union charges 12.8%. Japan charges nearly 20%, the highest of the group. The United States charge about 5%, the lowest of the group. The United States is the lowest of the group. Now compare these numbers to tariffs on manufactured products or services. In developed nations, those tariffs are usually only 3 to 5%. This is a huge gap. It tells us that agriculture receives special treatment almost everywhere. The result is that consumers in high tariff countries pay much more for imported food than they need to. That extra money could have been spent on their goods and services instead. Think about Japan for a moment. A 19.3% average tariff on food is roughly 4 to 6 times higher than its typical tariff on manufactured goods. This tells us that farm protection in Japan is not a small exception. It's a deliberate and very large policy choice, driven by a desire to protect traditional farming communities and food security. Many countries make a similar argument that a nation should never depend too heavily on imported goods. Since food supply can become a matter of national security during a crisis, that argument helps explain why foreign tariffs have proven so much harder to reduce than tariffs on almost any other category of the goods. Tariffs are only part of the story. Governments also give direct subsidies to farmers. This chart gives estimates from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. In Canada, subsidies cover about 70% of farm production costs. In the United States, the number is 21%. In the European Union, it climbs to 35%. In Japan, subsidies cover almost 59% of production costs. That is more than half across all OECD countries. Farm subsidies add up to more than $300 billion every single year. $300 billion. This is a massive amount of money. It shows that agriculture is treated very differently from most other industries in the global economy. If almost 59% of a Japanese farmers' protection cost is paid by government subsidies, that farmer is only partly operating in a normal competitive market. Combine this subsidy picture with the high tariff numbers from the previous slide, and you can see why agriculture trade and negotiations are so difficult. Farmers in these countries are protected from two directions at once, through tariffs at the border and through subsidies at home. So what does all this protection actually cost us? High tariffs and subsidies distort the way farm products are produced and traded. Prices rise for consumers almost everywhere. The total volume of a farm trade around the world becomes smaller than it should be. Governments often end up buying the extra crops that farmers overproduce because of subsidies. Earlier estimates from the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, suggested that removing these tariffs and subsidies would raise global economic welfare by $128 billion a year. Other researchers suggested a number as high as $182 billion. Adjusting for today's economy, a more realistic figure is close to $300 billion a year. There's another striking point here. If OECD countries remove all their farm subsidies, developing nations could gain 3 times more benefit than all foreign aid they currently receive. In other words, free trade in agriculture could do more for poor countries than traditional aid programs. This is worth pausing on. We often hear that rich nations should give more foreign aid to help developing countries grow. But this research suggests that simply opening up agriculture markets and removing subsidies that currently distort global prices could do more good for poorer nations than the aid budget of a wealthy government combined. This is a powerful argument for reform. Even though it remains politically very difficult to achieve, consider why reform is so hard in practice. Farmers in developed countries are often a small share of the population, but they are geographically concentrated and politically well organized. This lets them exercise influence over trade policy that is much larger than their overall share of the economy would suggest. Protecting intellectual property. Our third module is about this topic. This includes patent, trademarks, and copyrights. In 1995, the same agreement that created the WTO also created new global rules for intellectual property. This is called the TRIPS or TRIPS agreement. We'll look at what TRIPS requires and why intellectual property protection matters so much for innovation. This module connects very directly to any industry built on research and development, including pharmaceuticals, software, entertainment, and advanced manufacturing. Let's talk about the TRIPS, TRIPS agreement. It stands for Trade Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. It was created in 1995 at the same time as the World Trade Organization itself. TRIPS requires every WTO member to grant and enforce patents. Those patents must last at least 20 years. TRIPS also requires copyright protection lasting at least 50 years. Different countries were given different amounts of time to follow these rules. Rich countries have to comply within 1 year. Poor countries were given 5 years. The very poorest countries were given 10 years. This staggered approach recognized that weaker economies needed more time to build up their legal systems. Before TRIPS, intellectual property rules varied enormously from country to country. Some countries offered strong patent protection, while others offered almost none at all. Just allow, pirates. This made global business planning very difficult for research-heavy companies. TRIPS created a shared floor of protection that every WTO member must respect, which gave investors around the world much more confidence that their ideas would be protected internationally, not only inside their home country. This confidence matters enormously for decisions about where to locate research facilities and where to launch new products first. A company is far more willing to introduce its newest technology into a market if it trusts that market's patent courts to enforce its rights fairly. Why does all these protection matter so much? Weak intellectual property protection reduce the incentive to invent new things. Innovation is one of the main engines of the economic growth and rising living standards. Without strong protection, a producer in one country might just copy a patent product invented somewhere else. The textbook gives a clear example. Imagine a firm in India copies a patented innovation that was first created in the United States. This copying can affect trade in two separate ways. First, it reduced export opportunities for the American inventor inside India itself. Second, if the Indian producer also exports the copy to other countries, it reduces the American inventor's sales there too. There's also a bigger picture effect. If the total world market for the inventor shrinks, the inventor has less reason to take on risky and expensive research projects. The final result can be less innovative and less economic growth for the whole world economy. Think about how expensive research and development can be, especially in industries like pharmaceuticals or semiconductors. The company will only make that investment if it believes it can earn a fair return once the product succeeds. If competitors can legally copy the product the moment it launches, that expected return disappears and fewer companies will take the risk of inventing in the first place. This is the core economic argument behind strong intellectual property protection. Our fourth module looks at market access for non-agricultural goods and services. Tariffs on industrial products have come down a lot since the WTO and GATT began their work, but some high tariffs still remain, especially in a few specific product categories, and especially for developing nations. We'll use transportation equipment as our main example, since it shows this pattern very clearly across both developed and developing economies. Most developed nations have brought their tariffs on industrial products down to under 4% of value, but important exceptions remain. Look at transportation equipment as an example. Australia and South Korea, both are member of the OECD, still keep bound tariff rates of 12.5% and 8.2% on transportation equipment imports. Compare that to European Union at 4.1% and the United States at only 3% and Japan at 0%. Remember that a bound tariff rate is the highest rate a country is legally allowed to charge. This is often the rate that is actually applied, but not always. This table shows us that even among wealthy cooperative trading nations, some product categories still carry noticeable higher protection than others. If you worked for a car parts exporter, this table would matter a great deal to you. Exporting to Japan on paper looks completely open at 0%, but exporting the same parts to Australia could mean a bound tariff over 12%, a very real cost that changes your pricing and your competitiveness in that specific market. This is exactly why experienced exporters build country by country tariff schedules before they ever set a price, rather than assuming that one global price will work everywhere in the same way. Developing nations often keep even higher tariffs than developed nations. India's bound tariff rate on transportation equipment imports is 54%. Brazil's rate on the same category is 33.6%. These countries often use what is called the infant industry argument. They claim that new domestic industries need protection while they grow strong enough to compete. But high tariffs raise domestic prices. They protect inefficient local producers instead of pushing them to improve. Consumers end up paying much more than necessary for transportation equipment and related services. It's not only goods that face this problem. Tariffs on services also remain higher than tariffs on industrial goods almost everywhere. The average tariff on business and financial services is about 8.2% going into the United States, 8.5% going into the European Union, and about 20% going into Japan. Given how fast cross-border trade in services is growing, reducing these numbers could bring very large economic gains. The infant industry argument is a generally important economic idea, and it's not always wrong. New industries in developing countries sometimes do need temporary breathing room. But the risk is that temporary protection quietly becomes permanent protection, especially once local producers and their workers become a strong political lobby of their own, similar to the anti-dumping story from earlier in the lecture. Our fifth module is about the Doha Round. It's a long-running set of WTO negotiations. It began in 2001 in Doha, Qatar. It was supposed to take 3 years. Instead, it has continued for far longer than that, with very little real progress. Let's look at why. The Doha story is a useful case study for understanding just how hard it is to get almost 200 countries to agree on anything involving sensitive domestic industries like agriculture. In 2001, the WTO launched a brand new round of trade talks. These talks are called the Doha Round, named after Doha, the capital of Qatar, where the meeting was held. The talks were originally scheduled to last only 3 years. The agenda was ambitious. Negotiators wanted to cut tariffs on industrial goods and services. They wanted to phase out subsidies for agricultural producers. They wanted to reduce barriers to cross-border investment. They also wanted to limit the use of anti-dumping laws, the very tool we discussed earlier in this lecture. This was a broad and hopeful agenda when it started. Notice how closely this agenda connects to almost everything we have already discussed today. Anti-dumping, agricultural subsidies, and market access. The Doha Round was meant to be the moment when all of these separate problems finally got solved together in a single grand agreement covering the whole WTO membership at once. Was too ambitious. So why has Doha Round never finished? A major meeting held in Cancun, Mexico in September 2003. The core problem was agriculture. There was no agreement on how to reduce farm subsidies and tariffs. The European Union, the United States, and India were among the countries unwilling to cut protection for their politically important farmers. Meanwhile, countries like Brazil and some West African nations wanted free trade in agriculture as quickly as possible. In 2004, both the United States and the European Union tried to restart the talk. But since then, very little progress has been made. The talks remain stuck in deadlock, mainly because of continued disagreement over how deep the cuts to farm subsidies should be. The Doha Round is now a case study in just how difficult multilateral trade negotiation can become when politically sensitive industries are involved. As of 2020, negotiators were still discussing a goal of cutting tariffs by 60 to 70% and cutting subsidies in half. But getting every member country to agree to firm members have proven extremely difficult. This long delay is exactly why we'll see in the next module so many countries turning instead to smaller bilateral and regional deals. It's worth remembering that the Doha Round is not officially dead. It remains technically open, with the member countries still occasionally proposing new ideas. But after so many years without a breakthrough, most trade experts now treat it as a symbol of what multilateral negotiation struggles to achieve, rather than a process actively heading toward the final agreement. Our sixth module looks at multilateral and bilateral trade agreements because the Doha Round has made so little progress. Many countries have simply gone around it. they have signed their own separate trade agreements instead. Let's look at what these agreements are and how many of them exist today. This is one of the clearest examples in the whole chapter of how business and government adapt when a bigger plan gets stuck. Because the Doha Round has been stuck for so long, many nations have pushed forward on their own. They sign multilateral or bilateral trade agreements instead. These are reciprocal agreements between two or more trading partners. For example, Australia and China signed a bilateral free trade agreement in 2014. The United States signed a bilateral agreement with South Korea in March 2012. Under that agreement, 80% of U.S. exports of consumer and industrial products become duty-free. By 2017, 95% of bilateral trade in those categories were expected to be duty-free. Economists estimated this agreement would boost U.S. GDP by $10 to $12 billion. These deals are allowed under WTO rules as long as countries notify the WTO. And these are a lot of them now. As of 2019, more than 470 regional or bilateral trade agreements were in force around the world. Back in the year 2000, there were only 94. This huge increase shows just how much countries have turned toward the smaller, faster deals instead of waiting for a single, like a big, grand global agreement. Under the Obama administration, the United States also pursued two very large multilateral deals, one with 11 other Pacific Rim countries known as Trans-Pacific Partnership, and another with the European Union. Both of these larger efforts were later put on hold or abandoned once the political environment in the United States changed. Which brings us naturally into our next module. It is worth noting that these smaller deals are not a perfect substitute for global agreement. Each new bilateral deal creates its own separate set of rules, so a company trading with many partners can end up managing dozens of different tariff schedules and rules of origin at once, which adds real complexity even as it lowers tariffs. Our seventh module covers a difficult period for the world trading system. In 2016, two major events challenged the decades of progress toward free trade. These events were Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. Let's walk through what happened and why it matters so much for the future of global trade. Both events remind us that trade policy can change direction very quickly, even after decades of steady progress toward openness. The year 2016 brought two major shocks to the world trading system. First, British citizens voted in a referendum to leave the European Union. This decision is known as Brexit. It was a serious setback because the European Union has been one of the most successful free trade zones anywhere in the world. Second, Donald Trump won the 2016 United States presidential election. Trump held what economists can, do you remember the term mercantilist? We learned about the term in the previous class, right? So Trump held what economists call mercantilist views on trade. So this means he generally believes exports were good and imports were bad. And he was skeptical of many existing free trade deals. One of his very first actions in office was pulling the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This was a 12-nation free trade zone that had been closed to final approval. It was a striking reversal of prior U.S. trade policy. It was worth noting that Britain, despite voting for Brexit, still generally remained committed to free trade as a broader principle. The bigger question raised by these two events together was whether the United States, as the world's largest economy, would continue leading the push for freer global trade, or whether it would step back from that role. This question did not go away quickly. Even under the following administration, many of the tariffs from this period, especially those on imports from China, were largely kept in place, which shows how durable these policy shifts can become once they are enacted. Several other major actions followed in the Trump era. In early 2018, new tariffs were placed on solar panels, washing machines, steel, and aluminum entering the United States. The NAFTA, the long-standing agreement with Canada and Mexico, was renegotiated into a new deal. The administration also expressed open hostility toward the WTO itself, most notably in the trade dispute between the United States and China. The Trump administration sidestepped the WTO's own rule-based arbitration process. Perhaps the most damaging action came in late 2019. The administration blocked the appointment of replacement judges for the WTO's appellate body. This body hears appeals in trade disputes between countries. With only one judge left, the appellate body could no longer hear any new cases. This seriously weakened the WTO's ability to enforce its own rules across the entire membership. Think about what this means practically. If a company believes another country broke a trade agreement, it normally asks its government to file a WTO case. Without a working appellate body, that case may never receive a final, enforceable ruling. This uncertainty makes global trade riskier for every business that depends on WTO rules for protection. Our final module connects everything back to business practice. Why should an international manager care about the political economy of free trade? There are two main answers. First, trade barriers directly affect how a firm can organize its own strategy. Second, business firms themselves have real influence over government trade policy. Let's look at both. Everything we discussed earlier, anti-dumping, agriculture, intellectual property, and the Doha Round, eventually comes back to decision that real managers have to make inside the real companies. Let's talk about the first managerial implication, how trade barriers shape firm strategy. In an ideal world, a firm wants to place each part of its production process everywhere it can be done most efficiently. It might design a product in one country, make components in another, and assemble a final product in a third country. Trade barriers get in the way of this plan. Tariffs raise the cost of exporting components or finished products across borders. This can put a firm at a real disadvantage compared to local competitors who do not pay that tariff. Quotas create a similar problem. They limit how much a firm can sell into a country from outside its borders. In both cases, firms often respond the same way. They build protection facilities inside the country that's imposing the barrier, even if that raises their production costs. Local content regulations push firms even further in this direction, forcing more of the production process to happen inside the given market than the firm would otherwise prefer. There's also a forward-looking version of this strategy. Even when trade barriers do not exist yet, a firm may still choose to build a local plant simply to reduce the risk of future barriers being introduced. In other words, smart managers plan not only around today's trade rules, but around the trade rules they expect tomorrow. This is often called strategic positioning against future policy risk. And it's one reason large multinational firms often keep at least some production capacity in each of their major markets, even when a single centralized factory would look cheaper on paper today. Let's look at two concrete examples. In the 1980s and 1990s, Japanese automakers built a large amount of new manufacturing capacity inside the United States. This was partly a response to a voluntary export restraint agreement between the US and Japan that limited how many Japanese cars could be imported. Rather than accept a hard limit on exports, Japanese firms simply moved production into the United States itself. More recently, President Trump threatened high tariffs on companies that moved production to other countries and then exported goods back into the United States. In response, several automobile companies rethought their outsourcing plans. Ford and General Motors both modified plans that would have shifted some production to factories in Mexico. Instead, they announced plans to expand production capacity inside the US. Both examples show the same basic lesson. Trade policy does not just affect prices on the spreadsheet. It actively reshapes where global companies choose to build their factories. Notice that these two examples happened roughly 30 years apart, involving completely different countries and completely different presidents. But the underlying pattern is identical. When a government threatens or imposes a tariff barrier, firms respond by moving physical production, not just by adjusting prices. This is one of the clearest and most durable lessons in the whole chapter. This brings us to the second managerial implication, policy implications for business. Government intervention in trade has three common drawbacks. It can be self-defeating because it tends to protect inefficient firms rather than help them become truly competitive. It is dangerous because it may invite retaliation from other countries and trigger a broader trade war. And it's rarely well executed because narrow special interest groups often capture the policy process for their own benefit. Given these drawbacks, what should business encourage government to do? Most economists argue that the best interest of international business are served by a free trade stance, but not a pure laissez-faire or hands-off stance. In practice, this usually means encouraging government to actively strengthen institutions like the WTO rather than simply stepping back and doing nothing. Businesses generally gain far more from governments opening protected markets to imports and investment than from governments propping up specific domestic industries. This matters because so many firms today depend on globally dispersed protection system for their competitive advantage. Those systems only exist because of decades of freer trade. If firms lobby for protectionism at home, they risk retaliation abroad, which can put their own overseas sales and operations at real risk. So the final message for managers is this. It's usually in a firm's own long-term interest to support open markets rather than seek narrow protection. A firm should not automatically avoid tools like anti-dumping actions when it has a genuine case, but it should always think through the larger, longer-term consequences before asking its own government to raise trade barriers. A short-term win in one market can easily turn into long-term loss if trading partners respond with their own new barriers in return. Let's bring everything together with our takeaways. Anti-dumping rules can become political tools, not only economic ones. So managers must watch how governments actually use them. Agriculture remains one of the most protected sectors in the world through both tariffs and subsidies. TRIPS agreement created global minimum standards for patents and copyrights back in 1995, and strong intellectual property protection supports long-term innovation. Tariffs on transportation equipment and on service remain uneven across countries, with the developing nations often charging the highest rates. The Doha Round has stalled for many years, mainly because of disagreement over farm subsidies. In response, bilateral and multilateral trade agreements have grown very quickly as an alternative path forward. Recent events, including Brexit and Trump-era trade policy, have weakened confidence in the global trading system and its main institution, the WTO. Finally, trade barriers directly reshape how firms organize their production and their global strategy. Business leaders should generally support open markets while also thinking carefully and responsibly about their real costs that trade changes can create for workers and communities. If you remember only one idea from today, remember this. Trade policy is always a balance between the broad, spread out gains of open markets and the concentrated, very real costs felt by specific industries and workers. Every topic we covered today, from anti-dumping to Brexit, is really just one more version of the same underlying balance. Thank you for your attention today, and I will see you in the next class.